The irony is not lost on me that I spent 22 years investigating insurance fraud for a living, catching people who lied about what they owned, what they lost, what they were owed, and it never once crossed my mind to investigate my own stepmother. Not once. I was 14 when she moved in. My father had been widowed for 2 years, and he was lonely in that quiet, desperate way that widowers get when the house still smells like the person who left. Her name was Annette. She came with a warm smile, a lasagna she brought to our door in November, and a daughter named Sienna who was my age, and who I desperately wanted to be friends with. I remember thinking this could be okay. This could actually be okay. 6 months after the wedding, my father sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where my mother used to help me with homework, where we'd played Scrabble on Friday nights, and told me I needed to go live with my aunt in Kelowna. He said it was just for a while. He said Annette needed space to settle in. He said I was old enough to understand. I was 14 years old. I did not understand. I packed 2 duffel bags. I cried the entire 4-hour drive to Kelowna. My father hugged me at the departure gate and said, "I'll call you every Sunday." He called twice, then the calls stopped. I didn't go back home for 23 years. My aunt was not a warm woman, but she was fair. She gave me a clean room, meals at 6 o'clock, and the expectation that I would finish school, find a job, and figure out my own life. Which I did. I enrolled at UBC Okanagan, graduated with a degree in criminology, did my professional training, and eventually landed at a mid-size insurance investigation firm in Vancouver. I was good at the work. I was very good at it, actually. I knew how to find the thing people were hiding. I knew how to follow a paper trail through shell companies and backdated documents and signatures that didn't quite match. I knew when someone was lying to me before they finished their sentence, and the entire time I told myself I had made peace with what my father did. I had not made peace with what my father did. The message came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a claim file, a contractor in Burnaby who we suspected had staged a warehouse fire, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did. "Is this Waverly?" The voice was older. A woman. Careful. "Yes," I said. "Who's calling?" "My name is Sandra Yin. I'm a solicitor in Victoria. I was the legal counsel for your father, Edmund Mackay, until his passing last month. I've been trying to reach you. I need you to come to Victoria, but I need you to do something first. Please don't contact your stepmother or her daughter before we speak. Don't let them know you've heard from me." I sat very still. "My father passed away?" There was a pause. "I'm so sorry. I assumed you'd been notified." I had not been notified. I had found out my father died from a stranger on the phone on a Tuesday morning in March. I told my supervisor I had a family emergency. I drove to the ferry terminal at Tsawwassen and sat in car for 90 minutes staring at the water, thinking about the last time I'd spoken to my father. It was 4 years ago. He'd called out of nowhere, asked how I was, made small talk about the weather in Victoria like we were acquaintances. I'd been polite and distant, and we'd hung up after 11 minutes. I remember clocking the time because afterward I sat at my kitchen table and thought, 11 minutes, 20 years, and we managed 11 minutes, and now he was gone. Sandra Yin's office was in a narrow Victorian building on Fort Street, the kind of place that looked like it had been a law office for 100 years, and intended to be one for 100 more. She was in her 60s, white-haired, and had the particular manner of a person who has delivered difficult news so many times that she's learned to do it without flinching. She handed me a cup of tea and got straight to the point. "Your father executed a will in 2004, 2 years after your mother passed. In that will, he left you his property, the house on Fern Hill Road, plus a life insurance payout of $300,000, and his investment account, which at the time was worth approximately $200,000. At the time he signed that document, you were his sole beneficiary." I wrapped my hands around the mug. "At the time," I repeated. "In 2009, Sandra said, a second will was filed. It names Annette Mackay as the primary beneficiary. The Fern Hill property, the investment account, the insurance policies, all of it transfers to her. You receive nothing." I didn't say anything. "The problem," Sandra continued, setting her own tea down carefully, "is that I witnessed your father's signature on the 2004 document. I knew his signature. I knew his hand. And when I was shown the 2009 will by Annette's solicitor during probate proceedings last week, something about it didn't sit right with me." She slid a folder across the desk. "I'm not in a position to make a legal accusation, but I am in a position to make a phone call to the daughter of a man I respected, a daughter who, I understand, investigates exactly this kind of thing for a living." I opened the folder. I looked at the signature on the 2009 will. I'd seen my father's signature on birthday cards, on the few letters he'd sent during my first years in Kelowna, on a Christmas card he mailed in 2018. I'd spent 22 years learning how to read documents. The signature's the 2009 will was close. It was very close. But it was not my father's hand. I drove back to Vancouver that evening in a kind of controlled stillness that I recognize now as the feeling I get when a case breaks open. The noise in my head goes quiet. The grief. And there was grief, a strange, complicated grief for a man I'd barely known for 20 years. The grief stepped aside and let the investigator take over. I called my colleague at the firm, a man named Douglas, who owed me 3 favors and never asked questions. I told him I needed access to a certified forensic document examiner, off the books as a personal matter. He gave me a name. Then I sat down and I started making a list. The 2009 will had been filed during a period when my father was, according to Sandra Yin, showing early signs of cognitive decline. She'd noticed it herself at a meeting in 2008. Small things, repetitions, a confusion about dates. Annette had begun accompanying him to all legal appointments by mid-2008. By 2009, my father was signing nothing without her present. That was the window. The property on Fernhill Road had been my parents' home. My mother had grown up in that house. Her parents had built it in 1961. When her parents died, they'd left it to her, and when she died, she'd left it in trust to my father with the explicit understanding, documented in her own 2002 will, that it would pass to me. I pulled my mother's will from the provincial records database. I was still in my car in a parkade in downtown Vancouver, laptop balanced on the steering wheel, when I found what I was looking for. My mother had named the house specifically. She had been very deliberate about it. To my daughter Waverly, the property at 4 Fernhill Road, Victoria, BC, as her sole and absolute inheritance. The house wasn't just an asset. The house was mine before my father had any legal ability to redirect it. It took me 11 days. I want to be clear about what those 11 days looked like, because it wasn't cinematic. It was spreadsheets and certified mail, and 3 trips back to Victoria, and a lot of coffee at 2 in the morning, and 1 very long phone call with a property law specialist in Calgary who I'd worked with on a fraud case 2 years prior. It was reading 140 pages of probate filings and cross-referencing signatures across 6 different documents spanning 15 years. What I found, the forensic document examiner confirmed within 72 hours that the signature on the 2009 will showed inconsistencies consistent with guided hand signing, meaning someone had physically assisted my father in completing the signature. This is not legally a forgery in the strictest sense, but when combined with medical evidence of cognitive decline, it creates what is called undue influence, a legal ground for contesting a will in British Columbia. My father's GP records, which I requested through a process of consent documentation and a great deal of patience, showed that he had been assessed for mild cognitive impairment in early 2009. His doctor had noted concerns about his capacity to manage complex financial decisions without support. He had signed the 2009 will 4 months after that assessment. Annette's solicitor, a man in his 50s who I suspect had known exactly what he was filing, had failed to include the GP assessment in the probate disclosure. That omission was not an accident, and then there was the investment account. I'd asked Sandra Yin to send me statements from my father's account going back to 2006. What I saw made me set down my coffee and sit very quietly for a moment. Between 2007 and 2019, the account had been drawn down steadily, not in large suspicious lump sums, but in consistent transfers of between $8,000 and $15,000, 3 to 4 times a year, to an account I didn't recognize. When I traced the account number, it belonged to a numbered company registered in Alberta. The sole director of that numbered company was Sienna Walsh, Annette's daughter, my almost stepsister who I had once, very briefly, wanted to be friends with. Over 12 years, they had transferred approximately $620,000 out of my father's investment account. My father had died with $43,000 to his name. I want to tell you that when I found all of this, I felt righteous anger. I want to tell you it was clean and simple. But the truth is that I sat on the floor of my home office at 11 o'clock at night, surrounded by printed spreadsheets and sticky notes and a cold cup of tea, and I cried, not for the money, not even for the house. I cried because I kept thinking about my father at that kitchen table, telling me I needed to go to Kelowna for a while, and wondering, had he known, even then, that she was working on him? Had he been ashamed? Had he been afraid? Had there been a version of him that wanted to call me back and couldn't? I will never know the answer to that, but I knew what I was going to do next. I called a litigation lawyer in Victoria named Preetha, someone I'd referred cases to before, someone I trusted, and I laid out everything I had. She was quiet for a long time when I finished. How solid is the document examiner's report? As solid as they get, I said. And the GP records, certified copies, timeline is airtight. Another pause. Waverly, if what you're telling me is accurate, we're looking at a contested probate on undue influence grounds, a potential claim under the Wills, Estates and Succession Act for the property specifically as it relates to your mother's original bequest, and possibly a civil fraud claim for the investment account transfers. I know, I said. This is going to be a fight. Annette will retain counsel. She'll dispute everything. I know that too, I said. I've been waiting 23 years. I can wait a little longer. The probate challenge was filed on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Annette had called my cell phone, a number she'd gotten from somewhere I'm not sure where, and left a voicemail. Her voice was very calm and very controlled, which told me she was not calm at all. Waverly, I think there's been some misunderstanding about your father's intentions. He loved you very much, but he made his decisions clearly and of his own free will. I hope we can resolve this without it becoming something ugly. Please call me. I did not call her back. What I did instead was forward the voicemail to Preetha, who noted that attempted direct contact during ongoing legal proceedings was not advisable on Annette's part, and who sent a letter to Annette's counsel accordingly. 3 weeks later, Annette's solicitor, a different one now, more senior, filed a response contesting our challenge and arguing that my father had been of sound mind and independent will when signing the 2009 document. They submitted a statutory declaration from Sienna stating that she had witnessed her mother and my father discuss the new will over several months, and that it reflected his genuine wishes. What they did not know was that I had already spoken to 2 of my father's former colleagues, men he'd worked with at the municipality for 30 years, men who had visited him in 2008 and 2009, and noticed the same things Sandra Yin had noticed, and that both of them were willing to provide affidavits. What they also did not know was that Preetha had filed a separate application to trace the numbered company in Alberta, and that a forensic accountant I'd brought in to review the transfer records had identified something I had missed in my own analysis. 2 of the transfers, totaling just under $30,000, had been made on dates when my father was in hospital for unrelated procedures. Dates when he could not have authorized any transactions himself. That was no longer undue influence. That was fraud. The morning the RCMP file was opened, I was in Preetha's boardroom in Victoria when she got the call. She hung up and looked at me across the table and said, "They're proceeding." I nodded. "How are you doing with all of this?" she asked. It was a genuine question. I thought about it genuinely. "I think," I said slowly, "that I spent a very long time being angry at my father for sending me away, and I think I was right to be angry. But I also think that whatever happened to him after I left, however she got her hooks into him, he ended up as much a victim of her as I was, and that's a very uncomfortable thing to feel." Preetha didn't say anything, she just nodded. "My mother built that house with her parents," I said. "She grew up there, she left it to me. And for 23 years, a woman who married my father 5 years after my mother died has been living in my mother's house and drawing down my father's accounts, and none of it was ever going to come to light if Sandra Yin hadn't picked up the phone." I looked out the window at the harbor. "So I'm doing okay," I said. "I'm doing what I know how to do." The probate challenge was resolved 14 months later, which I know sounds like a long time, but in estate litigation in British Columbia, 14 months is actually quite fast. The forensic signature analysis, the GP records, the affidavits from my father's colleagues, and the transaction record and dates of his hospitalizations together formed what Preetha later described to me as one of the cleaner undue influence cases she'd seen in 20 years of practice. The court set aside the 2009 will. My father's estate, what remained of it, reverted to the 2004 will. I inherited the Fernhill Road property and the insurance policy. The investment account, by the time the fraud proceedings were complete, was subject to a civil judgment against Sienna personally for the amounts transferred during the period of fraudulent authorization. Sienna's numbered company was dissolved. Annette was required to vacate the Fernhill Road property within 60 days. On the criminal side, the proceedings moved on their own timeline. And I will not speak about the outcome of those here, because they are still ongoing as of the time I'm telling you this. What I will say is that the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit is thorough, and that patience is something I have learned. I went to the house for the first time in 24 years on a Wednesday in June, the day after Annette turned in her keys to the court-appointed administrator. I drove up the hill on Fernhill Road and sat in front of it for a few minutes before I got out of the car. It looked smaller than I remembered. The garden my mother had loved was overgrown. Not badly, but you could see it had been neglected in the particular way of someone who thought of it as an inconvenience rather than a living thing. The front step had a crack in it that hadn't been there before. The brass mailbox my grandfather had installed in 1968 was gone, replaced by a plastic one, but the bones of it were exactly what I remembered. The steep pitch of the roof, the bay window in the front room where my mother used to read on Sunday mornings, the maple tree in the side yard that had been barely taller than me when I was 14 and was now enormous. I unlocked the front door and walked through every room. It smelled like someone else, like candles and a particular brand of cleaning spray, and someone else's life lived in my mother's walls. I stood in the kitchen and I thought about that table where my father had told me I needed to go. Then I opened the back door and walked out into the garden. The light in Victoria in June is something particular, long and golden even late in the afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything look like a photograph of itself. I stood in my mother's garden, in the light that she had loved, in the house that her parents had built, and I let myself feel the full weight of everything I had been carrying for 23 years, and then I let some of it go. Not all of it. I'm not going to tell you some resolution in a courtroom erased 23 years of absence and 2 duffel bags and a 4-hour drive to Kelowna when I was 14 years old. It didn't. Those things live where they live, and they always will. But I stood in that garden and I thought I found it. I came back. I did not let them keep what was not theirs. That is enough. For now, that is enough. I went inside and made a list of what the garden needed. It was a long list. I was glad of it. I was finally home.